The Cold War, Roots and Background. To the causes and early history of the Cold War for freshman level American history. The Cold War was a political, strategic, and ideological struggle between the U.S. and USSR, which lasted from the end of World War II until the fall of Soviet Russia in 1991. Pitted the competing social and economic ideologies of the great powers, dominating world affairs for 5 decades, bringing it to the brink of destruction at its height. This video only covers its beginnings to about 1950. Massive ideologies, as I said. The United States representing democracy and capitalism on the one hand, and on the other, the Soviet Russian representing communism and a command economy. To understand the Cold War, you need to understand something about Russian and European history. The origins of all this goes back to around World War I and even before. It's important to understand that for centuries, Russia was ruled by a czar. All land was owned by wealthy elites, and the majority of the population were peasant farmers or serfs, bound to the land and landowner where they were born for life. This doesn't end until 1861, much like slavery in America, and shows us that the population was not unfamiliar with totalitarian rule. 17 and several years of World War I, the Russians were tired of war, death, starvation, and the czar. A bread riot quickly turns into a popular revolution in February, forcing the czar to abdicate. A provisional government steps up and tries to make democratic reform, but this is short-lived as in October, Lenin and the Bolsheviks seize power, and the world's first communist state is born. Russia withdrew from World War I, ceded much of their western territory to Germany, and for the next 3 years, the Bolshevik Red Army battles a civil war against the White Russian coalition for control of the country. The Allied powers moved in swiftly at the beginning to support millions of tons of military supplies that had been sent to the former Ally. Winston Churchill, then the Secretary of War for the British, declares that Bolshevism needs to be strangled in its cradle. Shows us why the Russians had some fear of Western intervention later on. The success of the communist revolution in Russia sparks the first Red Scare in America. There is much strife going on in the country, and in 1919, the Attorney General Palmer's home in Washington, D.C. is bombed. This was part of a series of attacks in 8 cities at that same time. In January of 1920, the Palmer raids were carried out by the Justice Department to round up anarchists and have them deported. However, they pretty much threw constitutionality and rights out the window doing this. World War II in 1939, Russia signs a non-aggression pact with Germany, and for the next couple of years, Hitler and Stalin just carve up Eastern Europe between them. By 1941, though, Hitler turns on Russia and attacks. Only the unusually bad winter that year and stiff resistance by the Red Army stopped the blitzkrieg at the gates of Moscow and Leningrad. Millions of tons of U.S. supplies, along with 500 divisions of Red Army troops, helped turn the tide in the east, and by May of 45, the Russians captured Berlin. But the country is decimated during the war. Rampant atrocities occur on both sides of the Eastern Front. Somewhere between 25 and 40 million of its population dies. It's behind in every way at the end of the war, except they have the largest standing army in the world. Before the end of World War II, in the spring of 45, the Big Three, Churchill, FDR, and Stalin meet at Yalta, at the Yalta Conference, to decide what to do with the rest of the war and what to do afterwards. They were unable to reach any agreement on Poland. However, they do agree to establish the UN, the division of Germany into 4 occupation zones, that there would be free elections in the Eastern European countries, and Russia promises to enter the war against Japan once Germany is defeated. In Potsdam, a few months after that, in the summer of 45, things have cooled considerably. Truman, who has replaced Roosevelt, who has passed, arrives determined not to repeat the mistakes of Versailles. He will be firm on war reparations, and he sees Uncle Joe Stalin basically as a thug, a criminal really, who rules with an iron fist and doesn't honor his agreements. Stalin sees the U.S. and the West as an imminent threat to the existence of communist Russia and is seeking a buffer in Eastern Europe against future attacks in the West. They are also looking for massive war reparations from Germany to rebuild Russia. A couple years, 46, 47, things really sour. The Russians set up puppet states in most of Eastern Europe, Hungary, Romania, Poland, and finally in 48 in Czechoslovakia. At the same time, the British and the U.S. and France rolled their spheres of influence in Germany into a single entity. Truman, seeking some insight on why the Russians act the way they do, department, and in response, George Kennan, the charge d'affaires at Moscow, writes what becomes known as the Long Telegram, an 8,000-word message where he describes what the U.S. needs to do, which he says is to have a firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. This will be the conceptual framework of our policy for the next several years. After that, Stalin gives his famous Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri, and the following Truman, in response to communist insurgents threatening Greece and Turkey, calls up what is known as the Truman Doctrine and sends $400 million in aid to these countries, which helps very much. And this becomes very quickly turns out into the Marshall Plan, which pumps millions of dollars of aid into the Western European countries. This aid is also offered to Russia and her satellites who refuse. Russia attempts to starve the Westerners out of Berlin, which is deep in the middle of their sector of East Germany. The Truman and the Allies respond with the Berlin airlift. And for the next year, 250,000 flights fly in everything the city needs to survive. Aggression leads the United States, Canada, and the Western nations to create NATO in 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In response, Moscow counters a few years later in 1955 by creating the Warsaw Pact, technically known as the Warsaw Treaty Organization. And there you have really the beginnings of the Cold War. The Cold War was between the U.S. and USSR. It pitted democracy and capitalism versus communism and command economy. It begins at the end of World War I and continues until 1991 when Soviet Russia falls. Key terms you're going to want to remember are the Yalta and Potsdam Conferences, Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan, Berlin Airlift, the Iron Curtain, Long Telegram, NATO, and Warsaw Pact. Thank you. Have a good day.